And you are live, Chair.
Thank you very much. I would like to call the Committee of the Whole meeting of September 29th, 2021 to order. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Mikulik, Counselor and Chair of the Planning and Economic Development Committee. We are meeting electronically through Zoom during this declared emergency period. Members of the public may observe the proceedings by accessing the live webcast at our YouTube channel. I'm going to now do a roll call. I will ask our Deputy Clerk to complete a roll call of council so that we can confirm quorum.
Thank you, Chair. Mayor Easton?
I'm here. Present.
Councillor Bernay?
Here.
Councillor Pachariva?
I am here.
Councillor McPherson?
Here.
Councillor Mikulik?
Here.
Councillor Reimer?
Here.
Councillor Timmers? Councillor Timmers?
I'm present.
Thank you. Councillor Rajima?
Present.
And Councillor Russell is absent from tonight's meeting and sends his regrets, but we have quorum.
Thank you very much. In addition, I want to take a moment to welcome the staff we have joining us today. Chief Administrative Officer Mike Kirkopoulos, Director of Legislative Services, our Town Clerk Julie Kirkolos, Director of Planning and Development Matt Bruder, Director of Special Projects Kathleen Dale, Manager of Planning and Development Monica Kokiara, Director of Public Works David Graham, Director of Community Services Shannon McKay, Fire Chief Greg Hudson, Director of Economic Development and Communication Paul Deaney, Manager of Corporate Communications Liliana Busnello, Director of Finance, Administration and Innovation Lawrence Wagner, Associate Director of Finance, Administration and Innovation Terry Tawala, Finance Clerk Kayla Snow, Human Resource Specialist Jacqueline Buchanan, Administrative Support Deanna Phillips, and moderating and clerking the meeting today we have our Deputy Clerk Devan Crick. IT is also in attendance, as well as we have Craig Rowe, Upper Canada Consultants, Emilio Raimondo, Upper Canada Consultants, Brian Tan, Senior Project Coordinator, Watson and Associates, and Gary Scanlon, Director, Watson and Associates. As this is a virtual meeting, I will ask that we follow some procedures during this electronic meeting. Should there be a connection or service disruption for the chair, or if quorum is lost, the chair and or deputy clerk will call a 10-minute recess to reconnect and regain quorum. If quorum is lost, the meeting will be adjourned. If connection is lost from the chair, the deputy clerk will ask those in attendance to wait up to 10 minutes to provide the chair time to reconnect and resume the meeting. Otherwise, after that time frame, the vice chair, Councillor Tony Brunet, will resume the meeting until the chair has reconnected and resumes their role. Each member of council who wishes to speak, please raise hand. Please use the raise hand feature on your video call, and the deputy will track our speakers list today, and then invite you to speak when I open it for comments or questions. Also, when I finish reading a motion and announcing the mover, the deputy clerk will then call out the vote by reading each member of council's name out loud. Please remember to take yourselves off mute during this portion of the meeting so that you can confirm if you support or oppose. Also, when not speaking, remember to put yourselves on mute. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none. Statutory public meetings. We have no statutory public meetings this evening. Planning and Economic Development Committee agenda. 5.1 delegations. We are now at the delegations portion of the Planning and Economic Development Committee agenda. Please note each delegation may speak for up to 5 minutes. Our delegation tonight is Craig Rowe and Emilio Raimondo, Upper Canada Consultants, regarding item 5.3.1, report PD-42-21, regarding zoning bylaw amendment and draft plan of vacant land condominium application by 1950578 Ontario Inc. CN 3-5-02-03 application PLZ BA 202101120 CN 3-5-02-05 application PLCV 2020121. Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. I was just catching up on the YouTube, so I think we're a couple moments behind. But my name is Craig Rowe. I'm a senior planner with Upper Canada Consultants. With me this evening is also Mr. Emilio Raimondo from Raimondo and Associates Architects. Just for the benefit of the committee this evening, we decided to make ourselves available if there were any further questions about the vacant land condominium and zoning applications that are going forward for 4423 Ontario Street. We've had the opportunity to review the recommendation report and the conditions, and we have no concerns with them, and we accept them fully. So again, just making ourselves available if there are any further questions of council or staff prior to going into any deliberations.
Thank you very much, Craig. Do members of council have any questions? Councillor Rinjema. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Mikulik. Thank you. This question may be better directed towards staff, but I will ask the consultants since they're here. I just, for those watching and interested in this application, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about process and what's coming next. I know that a site plan still has to be submitted and approved. Can you tell me what kinds of items would be covered through a site plan application? Because particularly I'm thinking of, I know that some residents had questions in the past about fencing on the site. So privacy fencing.
Question, Councillor. I think that would be best suited for Mr. Bruder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yep.
Thank you.
Good question, Councillor. Definitely items like fencing, landscaping, those types of things, they will be further addressed at the site plan stage, which is where we get into more of the detailed design. Usually at the zoning bylaw stage where we're at now, we look at things in terms of feasibility. We'll look at establishing the building envelopes and the overall site layout. And then when we get into the subsequent site plan process, should the application be approved tonight, that's when we would get into some of those details, as well as some of the further detailed design aspects of.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Brunet.
Thank you, Chair Mikulik. Through you to Mr. Rowe. I'm wondering, Craig, if you could just comment. I saw a number of resident concerns, not so much about height. This is a 3-story structure with rooftop amenities, but I'm seeing, comments similar to, infringing on my personal privacy and blocking the sun. I'm wondering, with those comments in mind, if you could just speak to the rooftop amenities and how some of those concerns will be alleviated on the roof and those amenities and any type of blocking or any other type of enhancements. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Certainly, through Mr. Chair to the councillor, great question. I'll probably defer a little bit of that to Mr. Raimondo. But the way that this is set up is the positioning of some of the amenity areas are, for example, units 1 to 12, which are lengthwise east to west. The primary focus of those amenities is looking south, and that's looking towards the commercial plaza. And then similarly for units 13 to 18, which back onto Christopher Court, those again are facing westward and more internal to the site. What's also required with this development, as you have seen in the report, is we need to procure a class 4 designation for the property. And with that, we have requirements from our noise consultant that we do need to have a taller glass railing along the side. So when you're sitting down in your rooftop amenity area, you'll have those barrier walls that are going to provide a bit of a block in view. The way the buildings are structured, yes, they're up and above, but we feel from a design perspective, really the views that are going to be appreciated the most by the people using these areas is you're going to be able to see the lake a little bit looking northward, but primarily you're going to be able to see the escarpment. So with that, maybe I'll just defer to Emilio. He can talk a little bit more about the form and function of that.
Sure, Greg, thank you. Yeah, the rooftop amenity, I guess, Counselor, just with respect to your question related to sunlight, I wouldn't, hedge to say that a 3-story structure would, in fact, inhibit sunlight to adjoining neighbors. I mean, the sun sits quite high in the sky. So I really don't think that would be or would have any really relevance or impact the height of the building on reduction of sunlight. But as far as amenity space is concerned, as Greg pointed out, generally the majority of them face the commercial side of the development. And the backside, we've actually stepped the extension back from the roof perimeter. So that provides additional privacy where you don't have the look over. We're proposing glass railings, but there's also the opportunity, and as we get through site plan agreement, we could even consider making some of the guards more opaque. So sometimes glass railings would allow more visibility. We've done projects where we've applied the type of glass used. We've gone to more of an opaque type glass or translucent glass. So you can't literally, view through the glass and down. So that could certainly provide additional privacy if required. So those are sort of areas that we can certainly review through the design process. Difficult question in terms of, a building height having relevance on people's privacy. In this particular case, we found that there is very little impact in terms of the overall height and the effects on the adjoining neighbors. So I hope that answers your question, Councillor Brunette.
Yes, thank you for those comments, and thank you, Chair Michalek, for the opportunity. I just have one additional comment, if I could, Chair.
Go ahead.
And this is either to our staff or to the Upper Canada or Emilio. So I'm seeing that there was some parking concerns that were raised by residents. That's not unusual. We seem to have those on most applications. It's expected. 18 units, 36 parking spots, 6 visitor parking spaces. Are we confident that the 6 visitor parking spaces is adequate for a building of this size?
Are you not to Mr. Bruder or to Craig Rowe?
Yeah, I'd like to see what our staff has to say with regards to that question, if I could, Chair.
Okay, Mr. Bruder.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, good comments for sure. We do hear about some parking concerns with respect to new development, kind of in general. As it relates to our zoning, yeah, they are meeting the requirements. They're actually going a little bit above with the visitor parking spaces here. We don't have that requirement in there. I think they do capture the intent of providing some overflow parking spaces. It's kind of a moving target to identify how many visitor spaces you would need. I've looked at other municipalities too, and this ratio is relatively similar to what I've seen for this type of building built form. So in that regard, I think it's pretty much in line with what we're seeing out there. So, to answer your question, I think it is adequate for this particular application.
That's great. Thank you, Chair Bruder, or Director Bruder. Thank you, Chair Michalek.
Thank you. Mary Easton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. To Mr. Bruder, again, I want to expand a little further on the parking. The 36 parking spots per unit, that is an assumption that one will be in the driveway and one will be in the garage. Is that correct?
Mr. Rowe?
No, I was asking Mr. Bruder.
Oh, Mr. Brute.
Yes,
okay.
sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct, Your Worship.
And so when we have carried out studies to find out how people do use their garages, it's my recollection that there was a pretty high and consistent lack of use of garages. Therefore, one car would end up on the street. Do you recall those studies that we did?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I know we did do a study. We looked at another neighborhood in Beamsville. We looked at Lincoln Square, and we looked at some of the, parking shortages that were maybe perceived in that area. And if I recall correctly, I think that study resulted in a very minimal result in terms of a shortage. So, I do agree with you that sometimes people use their garages for storage, but at the end of the day, this type of built form to have, that particular parking configuration, again, is not all that uncommon. And I've seen it before too, in this stated in purchase and sale agreements where, it's identified that, yeah, the garage is intended for a parking space. I think
so,
Monica has a point to add too,
okay.
Your Worship.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Through you, Chair. In addition, our site plan agreements also have a stipulation saying that in all purchase and sale agreements, they have to use the garage as parking and not for storage.
And so that's good to have that reinforced. And so would this become a bylaw issue if in fact we were having a problem in this particular development in the future? If there wasn't enough, if there appeared to be a shortage in parking, would we enforce that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think, what our site plan agreement does, what that clause does is ensure that gets carried forward, that the garage is intended for a parking space. Now, actually having that in a purchase and sale agreement, not a bylaw issue, but the result, if people fail to follow that, and then there is overflow parking elsewhere where it doesn't belong, then that would be a bylaw enforcement issue, yes.
Okay, so that's an important separation to make in terms of, so there really wouldn't be any enforcement unless there was a violation of a parking, there was an infraction in terms of our parking bylaw.
That's correct, Your Worship. It's not something that we can enforce through a bylaw, but that agreement that does stipulate that is registered on title of the lands. So it is something that's carried forward in perpetuity on the property that we've indicated that that's a requirement.
Okay, I think it's important to have had all of that reinforced. If you don't have an answer to this question, I have another question, Mr. Chairman. I quite understand. I should have asked you earlier today, but it just wasn't possible. I was looking at the results of the transit on demand and comparing ourselves with another community that has a denser population in its central area. And so we were about half in terms of the number of individual trips that were being made. And I wondered if that in itself, as our town is growing, whether that factor should be taken into account on a temporary basis in terms of the ratio of parking on site. Because it seems as though the makeup of our community at the moment demands that people have their own personal cars. Do you have any response to that, Mr. Bruder?
Certainly do, if you'll indulge me, Mr. Chair. Yeah, that's a good point for sure. But I think before we do that, I think we also have to look at, and we've already gone through this exercise a little bit, when we look at some other kind of similar municipalities that maybe don't have an on-demand transit system at all. and what they look at in terms of their ratios. When you look at, something here where you've got essentially, now I get your points about the parking in the garage, but there still isn't a lot of 2 spaces per unit, plus a few visitor spaces for this type of development. I don't think you're going to see in too many locations where there's more than that. I think that's already, taking into account the situation to some extent. And I think, again, that's something that you're going to see on a fairly wide basis. I just don't, in this day and age with building to a more compact build form, I think, going anything over and above that is not something that we would typically see.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. I thought it was an interesting circumstance, and it's been pretty consistent over the last months that data has been made available to us. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mayor Easton. Let's see. I'm going to ask at this time if Councillor Brunet could take the role of chair. I have a couple of questions I would like to ask Mr. Rowe and Mr. Raimondo.
Absolutely, Chair, go right ahead.
Thank you. Just through you to Mr. Rowe, was there any consideration by the developer to look at perhaps bungalows or 2-story homes?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, this is actually a really involved exercise. And one of the reasons why we landed on what we did is that the previous landowner who specializes in bungalow townhouse development, the geometry of the site just didn't result in an appropriate footprint for the building, combined with the private road on it as well. Based on their portfolio of development, they don't typically work into the 2-story townhomes or other built forms like that, which is why our current client who picked up the property was more keen to explore some more dense development options. One of the things that we also looked at was an apartment building, but then again, trying to provide the right amount of parking on site. In order to do that, we'd have to increase the height of the building to get underground parking and things of that nature, which I believe I spoke to at the public meeting. We ultimately ended up with some more narrower 3-story townhomes. And what that does is it allows us to maximize the development of the site, but also to cover the cost of the infrastructure going forward to do this development. Construction prices are very high right now, so getting a maximization of units is very important. And with the assistance of Raimondo and Associates, we feel that the housing product that's been provides the right amount of floor area, a unique architectural integration with Ontario Street, and meets the intent of the town's official plan policies and aligns nicely with some of those zoning provisions.
Thank you very much. And I asked that question because this was originally zoned an R1 piece of property neighboring a number of R1 zoned properties. So that's why I asked that question. The other question I have is, what is your target audience in terms of purchasers? Young, old, dual income? What is the target audience, and what's the estimated cost per unit?
Through Mr. Chair, I think that the location of the site is really conducive to a lot of different groups. We can't prejudice against one group or another when it comes to sales, but certainly the trend we're seeing is that people are moving to Niagara, moving out of more dense urban areas because they want a change in lifestyle. And typically with the vacant land condominiums, usually it can be an empty nester or retirees or people that are winding down their careers. But the location of this property being proximity to downtown, the future investments into the GO station and the quick proximity to get over to that, it lends itself to young professionals or young families and things of that nature. I would say that these would probably be competitively priced. If I had to guess, and don't hold me to it, I'd say probably over 700,000 based on current market rates for townhomes. So it would be a little bit more premium in terms of the price point, but that's really leveraging on really the proximity to all the great amenities that it's nearby. Downtown, transit, the highway, you're in wine country, you have lake and escarpment views. It's really an ideal spot for a development like this.
Thank you very much. And just one more question, Councillor Brunet.
Councillor.
These units are essentially 4 stories tall. 4 stories livable space or usable space. And without seeing the interior drawings or, the drawings of the building themselves, will these units have elevators?
Through Mr. Chair, I'll defer that to Emilio, but we certainly had conversations about that.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. As a matter of fact, I believe in the design, we created the potential, we roughed in an area for it. So I believe there's a potential to put an elevator in the project. That would be directly relevant to the purchaser and their requirements. We're finding the elevator certainly bridges the gap in terms of marketability and convenience. We're doing a very similar project, 3-story in Pelham currently for another builder, and they're actually including elevators in the design as part of the purchase requirement. So it's sort of a discretionary requirement, likely based on the purchaser. But I believe the developer is very open-minded to that.
Thank you again. I asked that question because if I was myself retired, or I'm, in the market for this sort of a new build, I feel I would have to be in pretty good shape to climb up four flights of stairs to get to the rooftop patio, or even 3 flights of stairs to get to a bedroom. So that's why I asked those questions. Thank you very much, Chair Brady.
Through Mr. Chair, if I might add just one point to that question, I think bungalow towns are very desirable because they are barrier-free and they're universally accessible. And I think what Emilio was speaking to is that our client is thinking forward and understanding that in some situations you're not able to have the bungalow towns, but still providing an opportunity to live in the community and roughing in for things like elevators or other mobility aids is really important to ensure that everyone can live and participate in the community more fully.
Thanks for those comments, Craig. And Chair Mikulek, I'll pass the chair back to yourself.
Thank you very much. Okay, so there being no further discussion, I have a motion moved by Councillor Reimer. The council receive and file for information the following presentation and delegation: Craig Rowe and Emilio Raimondo, Upper Canada Consultants, regarding item 5.3.1, report PD-42-21, regarding zoning bylaw amendment and draft plan of vacant land condominium application by 1950578 Ontario Inc., CN 3-5-02-03, application PLZ BA 202-10120 CN 3-5-02-05, application PLC VL 202-10121. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Bernay,
Yes.
Councillor McPherson,
Yes.
Councillor Mikulek,
Yes.
Councillor Pachariba,
Yes.
Councillor Reimer,
Yes.
Councillor Rajima,
Yes.
Councillor Timmers, Mayor Easton.
Yes.
Thank you. That carries.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to item 5.3.1, report PD-42-21 regarding zoning bylaw amendment and draft plan vacant land condominium application by 1950578 Ontario Inc., CN 3-5-02-03, application PLZ BA 202-10120 CN 3-5-02-05, application PLC VL 202-10121. Monica Kokiara, would you like to comment to this report?
No, I'm here for any questions if anyone has any questions.
Thank you very much. Do members of council have any questions? Councillor Brunet.
Thank you, Chair Mikulek. Through you to either Monica or to Mr. Bruder. You know, there's some comments here, some concerns about traffic and safety. I'm wondering from staff's perspective if they could, for the benefit of the concerned residents, if they could comment, you know, obviously, you know, this is a 18-unit townhouse. We're talking about 36 parking spots. You know, this is a regional road. Ontario Street is a regional road. So obviously we're working in conjunction with the region, but I'm wondering from staff's perspective, if we could comment on, you know, the traffic studies and the threshold and what this is going to do to traffic in Ontario Street from staff perspective.
Mr. Bruder.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, good question, Councillor. You know, as you mentioned, Ontario Street being a regional road, we collaborate a lot with the region on these applications. They're involved earlier on. And we did talk to them about, you know, traffic and some of those concerns, and we've been talking with them throughout. Typically, the threshold for a development, when you're looking at whether or not a fully blown traffic impact study is required, is about 100 peak hour trips per day, which would equate to, you know, in or around a 200 unit development. So to put that into context, here we are with only 18 towns. Not to say that the comments brought forward aren't valid, but from a volume standpoint on a regional road such as this, it's meant to handle a good amount of traffic on it. This isn't considered a significant contributor to an increase in traffic. So in that regard, there wasn't, the region didn't require a traffic impact study. We might, just turning movements and whatnot, look at some type of brief during the site plan process, but otherwise it's one of those things where it's acknowledged that, you know, Ontario Street being an intensification corridor and one that can handle all different forms of traffic can handle this very modest increase in traffic volume.
So Chair, if I could just continue, I appreciate those comments, Mr. Bruder. Through you, Chair, just on the same comments and concerns about traffic and safety, we as a council have been told that we're going to be going through I guess for lack of a different word, an Ontario Street visioning exercise. We as a council have been asking over the last number of years for traffic count studies at the corner of Ontario Street and Drake, going into the subdivision there. We've also been asking for signalization at the full intersection of beside the Old Post Bakery. There's a traffic light going north-south, but nothing coming out for those residents trying to turn onto Ontario Street. And we've been asking, you know, for signalization, and we keep hearing from the region that the counts don't justify a signalization. Through this Ontario Street visioning, is there an opportunity for us to be looking at some sort of traffic calming measures if the response we're going to continue to get from the region is no signalizations are justified? Because I think we'd all agree that traffic is increasing on Ontario Street. You know, the town is growing, so that's obvious. You know, early in the morning, if one's going down Ontario Street and there happens to be a train going down there, you know, traffic does get backed up. Is there an opportunity through this vision exercise as this project, this application is coming on board, as well as other applications that are facing us, to look at, you know, some sort of traffic calming measures to slow down traffic and to, you know, have some traffic calming measures through this visioning exercise. Through you, Chair, to Mr. Bruder or to Monica.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll answer that question. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, when we went through kind of identifying the scope in collaboration with the region of what would be included in that visioning exercise, to Director Graham's credit, he was very keen on making sure that we included traffic calming measures as a key consideration for the corridor as we look to develop improvements in both the private and public realm. So absolutely, that's included in the considerations. This is something we have initiated some work on that visioning study, and we expect to be coming forward with an introductory presentation for council shortly. And that'll better lay out the scope as well. But to your question, will that take into account some of this development and the need for traffic calming and other potential measures to deal with some of the increases in traffic that we see moving forward? Absolutely.
Yeah, and I asked that question, Chair. I asked that question only because, quite honestly, it does become frustrating, not only for residents, but for us as counselors. When we hear that, this is a regional road, and I think it's important not only for this application, but for other applications, as this intensification is going to come to us on this corridor, that people realize that we are listening, we understand there are concerns, and that, as a municipality, we are working in conjunction with the region to address these concerns. So I appreciate Mr. Bruder's comments, and I look forward to that visioning exercise moving forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Bernay. Councilor Pachariva.
Thank you, Chair McElect. Through you to Mr. Bruder. Matt, we've heard the concerns in the emails here that we received about, invasion of privacy and added traffic. And I mean, the report that we're going to see later on, where we said to the region with the Azalea development, why won't that should empty out onto Victoria Avenue? And we were told no. Yet this is emptying onto Ontario Street. Like, why is it good in one area and not in the other? So I know you're not a regional planner, but I'm curious if you've got a take on that.
Mr. Bruder.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think, with respect to this particular one, I'm not quite sure there's a massive difference here, but there was always the plan. I think there's been discussions going on with this particular site for quite a while, and that was always the plan, just to have this going out to Ontario Street. The Azalea development, I know that we've looked at it from a design perspective. I think there were some operational and maybe geometric concerns with having an entrance going out onto Victoria. Unfortunately, I don't have those details ready for you tonight. But the way, it was looked at, I can tell you how it was looked at for this application. Mm-hmm. And, again, having a relatively low volume of traffic coming and going from the site, rather than having it go through kind of a quieter residential area in behind, it was easy because Ontario Street was right there and there weren't any big operational or geometric concerns with the access coming out onto that road. So I know it only partially answers your question. Yeah. I can follow up with you further on the Azalea piece. Okay,
and then okay, so and if I may, Chair McCulloch, so just a couple other ones. And again, I like to find compromise in situations. So we've got the comments here about these buildings towering over and things like that. Like, could there not be a reorientation of the site plan that the 6 units across the back? I'm going to give you I'll give you a quick one first. So the road is put on the north side and the buildings orientate themselves to face to the commercial property, thereby not impacting any residents. So that's one. And then my second one would be, why not pull those 6 back units to be front facing along Ontario Street and then access through Alexandria for the other 12. So again, compromise. So you're keeping with the streetscape of the 6 units fronting on. You're not going to have all that traffic spilled on. So there's a couple of options there, I think, that are valuable to address a lot of the concerns that have been raised, but still maintaining the form of the development.
Mr. Bruder.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think a lot of the east-west kind of oriented block there, the reason why it's placed where it is there was also some consideration of the new incoming residents that would be living there and the proximity to the existing general commercial use that's right to the south. I think they were providing a little bit of separation there. As for, their height and towering over, I mean, they're still under the height provision that would have been the same that would have been applied in an R1 zone. So, I think what's happening here is when we talk about 4 stories, I think there's a little bit of a misperception here about how tall they really are. They're still coming in underneath that height requirement. And also I would note, when you look at some of the properties to the north, which is I think a lot of what you're speaking about, those ones there, they're still quite a good setback to the property line. It's in most cases, around 7 meters or more. And then there's another couple of meters at least until the house. It's not unusual for what we're seeing in other more stable neighborhoods as well when it comes to distance in between dwellings. And then finally, the block in behind that you were talking about, you mentioned bringing it up. Not a bad idea, but I think the thought there is there's also 2-story townhouses in behind where that block is to the east. And the thought was there's already a little bit of compatibility there with also a residential multiple or an RM1, if you will, use. So, while I agree with you, yeah, there's always options to look at every site. I think I've captured what was being considered in terms of laying it out here.
I appreciate that. So, and if the back matches a similar development on the east side, then I'm okay with that. But, I would seriously look at moving that private road and because it's the new residents that are going to move in don't know any different from what's there. So it's about, trying to cause less impact to the existing residents. So if those two were flip-flopped, the plaza is a medical building. So it's not like there's people that are, it's not operating on Saturday and Sunday. It's not operating after 5 p.m. at night. So you would still have that separation. Right. And I think you'd get more buy-in to it. Just my 2 cents anyway. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patrieva. So correct me if I'm wrong, if we approve this to Mr. Bruder, if we approve this motion that's coming forward with, there is no opportunity to change the site plan as to what Councillor Patrieva is describing or just talking about. If we move this forward the way it is, what we see is what we're going to get.
There might be some potential for some refinement and maybe potentially some minor reorganizing. I know too, I should have mentioned that there is a storm easement running through the property as well, I believe. Can't remember the exact location, but that also affects where the buildings go. So essentially we are establishing, a residential multiple zone with site-specific provisions. As long as they stay within those provisions, is there a little bit of room within the site itself for some tweaks? For sure. But yeah, I wouldn't think a full reorg of the site would be able to be done.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Brunet.
Thank you, Chair. I just had one additional question through you to staff, to either Monica or to Matt. I always look, when we get these applications, I always look at the site-specific provisions that an applicant is asking to change. So, obviously the one that jumps out is the minimum front yard. They're looking for 2.7 meters where 6 meters is required. It's obviously a significant ask. And then we're hearing that the region is taking, 3 meters to widen Ontario Street. I asked this question only because, with the bench condos being built beside the Butcher and Banker, I can't believe how many times I've heard from people over the last 6 months or so, man, that building seems like it's sitting right on the sidewalk. I'm wondering if staff could comment on, this minimum front yard setback change and, what the intensification corridor is meant to look like from a regional or a town perspective.
I see Tokiara has her hand up.
I can take that question. Thank you, Chair. So yeah, so the region is taking a 3.1 meter road widening. The main wall of the proposed building is set back from that road widening 3 meters. There's a little bump out by the front porch area that would make that front yard setback 2.7. Now, the required front yard setback is 6 meters. So taking into consideration that 3.1 meter road widening, and then the main wall being 3 meters, it visually would be a 6 meter setback. And then from to the sidewalk, it would be closer to 7.5 meters sidewalk. So yes, the 2.7 meter front yard setback is from the road widening. Also, with regards to the intensification corridor urban design guidelines, the guidelines are looking for buildings closer to the road. So, I mean, with this being in the intensification corridor, we feel that it aesthetically it's appropriate.
So just to clarify through you, Chair, to Monica, so what you're saying from a planning perspective, if I'm understanding from a planning perspective, the idea is in these areas of intensification that the idea is to have the building closer, but have the parking at the rear of the buildings. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So buildings closer to the road, parking at the rear. That's what the design guidelines say.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on that question, I'm trying to visualize what Monica is saying. So Monica, if in fact the region did widen Ontario Street, which I think we anticipate they will at some point, how far would that step be from the new sidewalk?
Thank you. Through you, Chair. At this time, there are no plans to widen Ontario Street along this frontage. But if they were to take that widening, from the road allowance, the front porch is 1.2 meters and the main wall of that building would be 3 meters.
So thank you, Monica. So 1.2 meters. So we basically got 3 feet from, roughly 3 feet from the sidewalk to the step.
Correct.
So in fact, it is on the sidewalk, more or less sidewalk that people would step down off their step to 3 or 4 feet and be on the sidewalk.
I mean, if the sidewalk is going to be right at that property line, which typically it wouldn't be, but currently that front porch is, like I said, about, I would say just over 6 meters from that porch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Rengiema, or excuse me, before I get to allow you to ask a question, Matt, Mr. Bruder, you had your hand up. Did you want to provide additional comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do. Just about that whole, situating the buildings closer to the road. Along an intensification corridor like this, we're going to have a mix of land uses. We're going to have a lot of commercial land uses. Typically, to maximize commercial viability on the ground floor, you've got higher ceilings and you've got the buildings really interfacing well with the streetscape, i.e. being extremely close to the sidewalk, creating a more active corridor. When we look at new developments like this, although there isn't a commercial component in this per se, you want to keep kind of a consistent streetscape too, rather than kind of a jagged in and out front yard setback. So that's another reason why we didn't see an issue with this particular front yard setback, because even if the region does take a widening in the future, we feel like it would still be in line overall with what we'd be seeing with redevelopment along the corridor. So I just wanted to add that piece.
Thank you, Mr. Bruder. Councillor Rengiema. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Mikulik. So I want to expand a little bit further, ask a couple more questions further to what Councillor Pachariva was asking. I find it interesting. It's an interesting question. So Mr. Bruder mentioned an easement. I see where the easement is. It runs it's at the far end of Unit 12 and it runs northeast to southwest. So I could see that would need to be protected. My question about the possibility of adjusting and massaging this concept during site plan stage, it's got me thinking because I know there's a number of site-specific items that have been asked for here. So those I think are pretty specific to the layout as it is. And if the layout were to be quote unquote massage later on, I would imagine that might give rise to the need to change those site-specific permissions in the future, or it's a possibility anyway. So I think Councillor Pachariva's question about moving it to the other side, I'm wondering if moving units 1 to 12 to the south and the private road to the north, I'm wondering if the consultant can comment on that.
Yeah, I'll allow that. He's still in attendance from what I can see. Mr. Rowe, you still there?
Yep, I'm here, Mr. Chair. Yes, through you to the councillor, we tried a variety of different orientations with this site. The storm easement was the most problematic because we had to provide it. It affects the geometry of the site and the ability to put the properties right up against it. It results in a reduction of units. It limits also our locations to put the transformer that's going to be required for this. And we felt that in terms of a compatibility standpoint, it would be better to have the private road against the parking lot. So if people are pulling into the plaza to the south with their headlights on, say later in the year when it's dark earlier, they would be facing into the development. And then the traffic along traffic, we felt if we put the private road right against the residential developments that exist to the north, that would actually be a less compatible interface than having the residential component up against residential as well. And then providing that variable setback, we have a sidewalk proposed through there, which is going to be densely vegetated with trees and plantings of that nature to kind of soften any of that impact. But the orientation to move it to the other side creates some challenges in terms of being able to get a unit yield on here that's appropriate for our client. And we also felt that there may be more nuisance associated with having those units backing right onto a commercial parking lot than residential.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Easton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bruder, through to Mr. Bruder, if we took a walk down Ontario Street, pretty much from the corner of Serena and Serena and May Street, I think we'd see some excellent examples of that policy in action. And I do remember, Councillor Pachariva will remember, when that policy was implemented. I think there was a modification that Council made to Shoppers Drug Mart so that their front door wasn't facing on the street. I think the decision worked pretty well, you know, in retrospect. It is a very busy street and it's a pretty safe passage to the back parking lot. Deputy Mayor Renchima was on council at the time as well. So now, you know, we move into a situation where we're talking about climate change, we're talking about connectivity. I look at what is happening in the back of those parking lots and how provision has been made for connectivity into the communities. And these are all design features which are coming to fruition. It's what they were planned to do. And so when you go down Ontario Street and you look at each of the properties that have all the parking spaces in the front, there just isn't any other choice. And a huge amount of space, much more parking area is required because of the configuration of the properties. So my question to you is whether or not you think, you know, can you speak to the issue of climate adaptation and climate change in terms of the way we're approaching this, this development, as well as a number of the other planning features, which I think by now, and by virtue of the reports that I'm reading here, the public are becoming more aware of what the policy is, and they know that we are required to follow the policy. However, there are a great deal of amenities assigned to this property that are attached to this property that we've spoken about tonight that are quite desirable. So what about the issue of climate adaptability?
Who would you like to direct that question to, Mary Easton?
I was directing it to Mr. Bruder.
Okay, Mr. Bruder.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, we look through the lens of climate change adaptation through all developments moving forward, and how we typically look at it is what are the opportunities that we can address right on site. I'm thinking of things like low impact development, smart incorporation of landscaping to reduce the runoff velocities. You want to make sure that you're not just shooting, water runoff, increased volumes nonetheless, just on, impermeable surfaces out off the property. So we're always making sure that we're looking at evaluating innovative ways to kind of interrupt that, have more infiltration available in the site wherever we can. That's something we work closely. It's a little more of a site plan issue to work out the detailed design items of that. We look at plantings of trees and other things that soak up some of the water. We even could look at, we haven't gotten too far down the line of some of the rooftop amenities, but there might be an opportunity there to address some rooftop drainage as well, maybe rainwater collection. All of these things, although they might sound small by themselves, they can add up to a pretty significant contribution towards that adaptation. So those are conversations we always continue forward into the detailed design stage.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. And just as the reports have changed over time, I noticed quite a significant change in the way this report is presented, because it specifically responds to public concerns and provides, I think, some very sound answers. It's not a matter of do we agree or disagree. There are some facts that need to be considered as we bring these developments forward, and it is a very good report. So when the site plan is done, of course, we don't see the site plan, and so we will know about all of those considerations. Is there another way that we can evaluate how effective those discussions will be with the developer?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think, I know this is a priority of council, of our community, to make sure that we're addressing these items. So, I think through communication with me, you can certainly gain some insight into that, absolutely, as we move forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Mr. Bruder.
Thank you. I'm going to ask once again if Councillor Brunet, Vice Chair Brunet, can take the chair while I have some questions that I'd like to ask.
Absolutely. Councillor Michalak, go right ahead.
Thank you. Just with regards through you to Mr. Bruder, property originally is zoned R1. How many homes or how many houses would existing residents in the area have been thought to be allowed to be built possibly in the future in a lot that is owned R1?
It's kind of hard to say, Councillor. I don't know. We've got probably enough room for, I don't know, when I'm looking at it here, maybe there could be enough for 5, maybe 6. But the orientation of the site isn't really conducive to many single detached lots, just the way it's oriented, off of Ontario Street. It's long and a little bit more narrow.
Okay, appreciate that. So the property was purchased as an R1 property, correct?
That's correct. That's what the current zoning was. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then through you, the commercial building, the Fleming, I believe it's the Fleming building next door. How How many stories or what is the height of that building?
I believe that's coming in at the required height too of 12.5 meters, but I could be mistaken. That is the max height there, unless Monica's aware, but I believe it'd be that height or a little bit lower.
Thank you. And it's two stories though. It's two stories.
That's correct.
Okay, and then through you, just one more question regarding waste collection and garbage pickup. Who will be responsible for, I didn't see that in the report anywhere. How would garbage pickup and how would waste pickup be dealt with and at whose responsibility? How would that be communicated to prospective purchasers?
That's a good question, Councillor. So usually what happens at that point is when we get into detailed design, should this application move forward to that stage, then when we receive the detailed design submissions, we would circulate to the region who would evaluate it in terms of waste collection and whether or not it's accessible for their waste collection vehicles. If it isn't, this being a condominium development, then they would have to proceed with private waste collection, which is not unusual. We see it all the time with these types of condominium developments. I'm not sure yet if that will be possible through the regional collection or private. That gets determined later, but it's something that we do iron out in the site plan process, and we actually include that as well in the site plan agreement that's registered on title.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all the questions I have. Okay. There being no further discussion, I have a motion moved by Councillor Brunet. Council approves zoning bylaw amendment. Application PLZ BA 202-10120 in the name of 1950578 Ontario Inc., subject to the following conditions. A, that a holding provision be placed on the zoning of the lands and that the holding provision not be removed until the applicant has entered into a site plan agreement and the agreement has been registered on title. The applicant has submitted the letter of credit and cash payments required by the agreement, and council approves a class 4 area designation for the subject lands as recommended by the environmental noise feasibility study prepared by Val Acoustics Canada Limited, dated June 9th, 2021. Council approved draft plan of vacant land of condominium application PLC V2VL 202-10121 in the name of 1950578 Ontario Inc. in accordance with the plan outlined in Appendix A and in accordance with the provisions of the Planning Act and the Condominium Act and regulations thereunder, subject to the conditions outlined in Appendix E, and that all parties be advised of council's decision on the draft plan of condominium application in accordance with provincial regulations. Note, appeal period is 20 days from notice of decision, and the Director of Planning and Development be authorized to endorse the draft plan as approved 20 days after the notice of council's decision has been given, provided that no appeals against the decision have been lodged, and that the applicant be advised that the draft approval of this plan will lapse 3 years from the date of draft approval unless town council grants an extension of the approval period. If an extension is requested, an updated review and revisions to the conditions of draft approval may be necessary at that time. And council declare they have considered all of the written and oral submissions and agrees with the planning report analysis and recommendation, and finds that, subject to the concerns of approval, this application meets the Planning Act criteria, is consistent with the provincial policy statement, and complies with the growth plan, the Niagara Regional Official Plan, and the Town Official Plan, and council and enact and pass zoning bylaw attached as Appendix D of this report to amend the zoning regulations for land described as Lot 9 of Corporation Plan 3 in Beamsville, Ontario, and council deemed that zoning bylaw conforms to the official plan for the town of Lincoln. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Renee? Councillor Bernay? Councillor McPherson?
Yes.
Councillor Micklick?
No.
Councillor Pachariva?
Yes.
Councillor Reimer?
Yes.
Councillor Rejima?
Yes.
Councillor Timmers?
Yes.
Mayor Easton?
Yes.
And Councillor Bernay, I see that you've jumped back on.
Yeah, sorry about that. I got kicked out. Yes.
Thank you very much. And that motion carries, Chair.
Okay. Consent agenda. There are no consent agenda items this evening for the Planning and Economic Development Committee agenda. 5.3 reports. There being no additional reports to consider for the Planning and Economic Development Committee agenda. We have now concluded the Planning and Economic Development Committee agenda. We will now rotate to allow Councillor and Chair Paul McPherson to resume the role, the chair at this time for the General Business and Finance Committee agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are now at delegations of the General Business and Finance Committee agenda. Please note each delegation may speak for a maximum of 5 minutes. Our delegation tonight is Byron Tan, Senior Project Coordinator, Watson and Associates, regarding item 6.3.1, 2021 reserves and reserve funds update. The presentation is approximately 15 minutes. Prior to proceeding with the presentation, I will ask that council proceed with a majority vote to extend the speaking time for the delegation. I have the motion moved by Councillor Timmers that council extends the speaking time for the delegation from Byron Tan, Senior Project Coordinator, Watson and Associates, until presentation is complete. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Bernay?
Yes.
Councillor McPherson?
Yes.
Councillor Micklick?
Yes.
Councillor Pachariva?
Yes.
Councillor Reimer?
Yes.
Councillor Rejima?
Yes.
Councillor Timmers?
Yes.
Mayor Easton?
Support.
Thank you. That carries, Chair.
Thank you, Byron. Please go ahead.
So it's Byron and myself, Gary Scanlon, have worked with town staff in preparing the reserve and reserve fund report. I'll do the speaking tonight, and I think the clerk's got a presentation, if I'm not mistaken, or do we need to pull it up?
I do. Give me one moment and I will pull it up for you.
That'd be appreciated. And it's a pleasure to be before council again. So this represents a second presentation that we've made to members of council. I'll recap in a few slides what we've talked about to date, and then move forward with these with the second part of our assessment. Next slide, please. So, yeah, as I've noted, we'll do a recap of the study process and then move on with the analysis. So next slide, please. The timing we initiated back in May. If you recall, mid-July, we did have a meeting with council members to review the first part of the analysis, and now we're before you once again. And we'll be looking to provide the final report, the written report, in the mid to late October. Next slide, please. So a couple of things just to go back over what we talked about in the earlier sessions. Reserves and reserve funds provide a mechanism for basically for councils to legally save money to finance all or part of future infrastructure, purchasing equipment, or potentially other requirements. They provide a degree of financial stability by reducing reliance on external debt to either finance capital projects and other types of acquisitions, or even in the short term, you may need to borrow in order to deal with the early part of your operating expenditures and such until you fully receive all of your collections from property taxes. In uncertain times, they can also provide some type of budgetary option to mitigate the need to either raise taxes or cut services. Next slide, please. There are basically three categories that we talk about. There are obligatory, and when we use those words, those mean that it's the reserve fund is generated by legislation. So things such as the Development Charges Act identify that you must set the collections have to be set in a reserve fund, can only be used for the intended purpose they were collected for. Similarly, if you do parkland cash in lieu, if you do other type of planning act fees such as parking in lieu, if you're doing gas tax, for example, is another one where it's obligatory. So you must set the monies that you receive aside in those reserve funds, and then there's an accountability on how they're spent. We then get into discretionary reserve funds or discretionary reserves. And discretionary reserve funds are those that you've created by bylaw. So you've set up a bylaw to establish these particular types of funds. And if it's discretionary in that it's not mandatory, but you've elected to create these reserves or reserve funds for a specific purpose. So if this discretionary is backed by a bylaw, then it's a reserve fund. If it's created by allocation, maybe by resolution of council, maybe created during the budget process, then potentially it's called a reserve. So these are subtle, but the way that they're created and then how they operate is slightly different. Council can set up a reserve or reserve fund for any purpose on which you have the authority to spend money. So you have very broad powers. Next slide. And when we look at these, we categorize them into really 4 different categories. They're there to provide for operating expenditures. So we're trying to mitigate year-to-year fluctuations in either tax collections or expenditures such as winter control, or perhaps for other types of things such as your building permit collections help to fund. You have peak seasons of building activity, low seasons. So those revenues help to smooth out the expenditure fluctuations. Capital is fairly straightforward. You're looking maybe for asset management, put money aside to help smooth out, minimize the amount of debt that you need and kind of smooth out the transfers from your operating budget year to year. Working funds are generally as I've noted, the early part of the year. You are making expenditures for operating purposes, paying staff, paying different types of invoices or bills, but your major collection of taxes may not come in until, let's say, April. That's when you do your first installment of taxes. Now, this can be mitigated a little bit. Recently, a lot of municipalities allow for month-by-month payments. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into the later in the presentation. And then the statutory, we talked about that. That's where you have statutes like the Development Charges Act, parkland, cash in lieu, et cetera. Those are statutory and those are created as a result of legislation. Next slide. right now, this is a listing of the reserves and reserve funds that you have. So we've got, once again, the obligatory, and you've got development charges, cash in lieu of parking, parkland, building permit fees, Canada Community Building Fund, which is basically the gas tax, and then aggregate resources. So for aggregate, you get a certain, I think it's 12 cents per ton of aggregate that's moved along your roadways. It's a contribution back to help you fund road expenditures. You've got operating related, so general insurance, winter maintenance, operating rate stabilization, and then for election costs, you put aside money. Elections happen every 4 years, so you're trying to put away money every year in order to smooth out that big time expenditure in the 4th year. You've got capital related, so that's the largest amount of capital or reserve funds that you, reserves and reserve funds you have. You've got water and sanitary sewer, infrastructure, building facility, equipment replacement, and capital rate stabilization. And then you've got some special purpose related to the museums and community improvement plan, et cetera. And lastly, you do have a working funds reserve as well. So what we recapped early on with council, we've given you a perspective of how those reserves and reserve funds kind of get set out. Obligatory, and then those which are statutory, those for operating, capital, and working funds. Next slide, please. So through the process, we work closely with staff. So we've taken a look at your existing reserves and reserve funds. So later in this presentation, we'll recap those and we'll give you perspectives on whether they should be continued, whether they should be amalgamated, whether they should be closed, whatever. We have already gone through, and I'll recap this for you, the policy framework. So that was the last meeting to go through a number of different items with you. And then there's specific policy components by individual reserve or reserve fund. So their purpose, source of funding, targets. And then, as I've noted, we'll talk about maybe consolidation or closure of some of these reserves and reserve funds. Next slide. So as a recap, July 21st, we gave you the broad policy statements. We talked about the purpose and the objectives. So what we'll be, in essence, providing is a full framework on how the purpose of it, defining these reserves and reserve funds, how to do the management of it, and then standard of care, annual reporting, and then responsibilities for overseeing and reporting back to council. So that's the first part of what we've done, is to prepare that document. And we've received comments and dialogue from councillors and incorporated those into our, we'll incorporate those obviously into our report. Next slide. So what we're looking to do now is to move forward into our analysis and then talk about the recommendations. Next slide, please. So just to give you a perspective, one of the things we did as we move ahead was we not only looked at obviously your reserves and reserve funds and the balances and the purposes and such. We also did surveys of most of the other municipalities in the region in order to give perspective of where your policies are relative to basically your neighbors. Next slide. This gives you a perspective on total dollar amounts that the municipalities have set aside. They have discretionary reserves and they have discretionary reserve funds. Once again, they're very similar, except a discretionary reserve fund is encased within a bylaw. Discretionary reserves are basically created by allocation or resolution. Subtle difference, but if you look at how we must do financial reporting to the province, the distinction is set out. So we've given you a total of your discretionary reserve funds. Now, this information is based on the 2018-19 FIRs. So it's a couple of years behind, but it's the latest and greatest information we could grab to compare the other municipalities. So you can see if you total up your discretionary funds, you can see basically you're right in the middle with about $19 million. The highest amount is in Niagara Falls with about 85 million. Wainfleet is the smallest at about 3.5 million. There's also those obligatory reserve funds. Once again, those are created by statute, development charges, cash in lieu of parkland, etc. So you can see the balances there. And then we've given you a total. Once again, with your neighbors, you're sitting right in the middle of the total collections that you have sitting in the reserve funds. Next slide. Now, because there's different size municipalities, obviously Niagara Falls is larger than, significantly larger than Wainfleet. It would be, relatively easy to jump to say, well, I think probably Niagara Falls has higher reserves than others. So we thought we would present it on a per capita basis, and that gives you a little bit more perspective of the dollar amounts that have been set aside relative to the population size of the municipality. So it's a representative number. You can see that on a per capita basis, we've given you the discretionary. So the lowest amount is in Pelham, and they're running at about $300 per capita. And the highest amount is Thorold, and they're running at about $2,400. Once again, you're in the midpoint with $805. Now, if we add the obligatory reserve funds, so that funds that are set aside by statute, you can see that the highest is almost $3,400, the lowest $531. And once again, you're right in the middle at just below $1,600 per capita. Next slide, please. The last thing we also looked at was, let's take a look at commonality of the reserves and reserve funds that are set up. You can see above the top table is the obligatory ones. So DCs, Parkland Dedication, Gas Tax, Building Code Act, and Subdivider contributions. So for the most part, you have 4 of the 5, which is very common across most of the municipalities. What you don't have is some special reserve for subdivider contributions. Now that could be something very unique where money is set aside for a specific purpose. So the funds that are contributed by the subdividers for that specific purpose can only be spent for that. So they've, a few of the municipalities have set up that special type of reserve fund. You can see on the reserve side, you have many of the common reserves. You don't have library right now. That's something that we'll talk about a little later. Protection reserves is more of the perhaps building enforcement and other contingencies. But for the most part, you've got the major common reserves and reserve funds that most of your other neighbors have. Next slide. So as part of the analysis, so as I say, we went through the broader policies. So really the framework last time on how the reserve funds will be managed, set up, etc. And for this round, what we're doing is now getting into each of the individual reserves and reserve funds and doing some analysis. So we're setting aside the purpose. So we're defining the purpose of the reserves or reserve fund. We're identifying the source of funding that'll be used, and then target balances, minimum, maximums, in order to give you guidance on a go forward basis on how to manage these reserve and reserve funds. So this will give guidance to finance when they come forward with the, your annual operating and capital budget process. This will be part of the information that you're provided with in order to understand, the resources other than taxes or debt that you may have available to assist in funding those expenditures. So if we start into the subsequent slides, we can show you some of this analysis. Next slide, please. So we talked about the obligatory reserves and reserve funds. Once again, we got DCs, building permit, cash in lieu of parkland, cash in lieu of parking, gas tax, and then aggregate resources act, which is basically for gravel. Next slide, please. And generally, as a common statement, these obligatory reserve funds are very similar. So the purpose is to fund specifically what's provided for or allowed for by that legislation. So DCs are for growth-related infrastructure. Cash in lieu of parkland is for the acquiring parkland or for park-related expenditures, and et cetera. So there's a definition within the legislation on what they'll be used for. The funding generally is also established through the legislation. Development charges, we have to go through a special process in order to justify the quantum of the charges and what projects will be funded. Similarly, you've got to go through a process with parkland, and there's some changes in the Planning Act. So all of these have their own processes. The target balances basically should be equal to the budgeted or the forecast expenditure amounts and should never go below zero. If for development charges, for example, if you don't have enough money in the reserves, you're allowed to go out and debenture, so growth-related debentures, and then draw from the reserves, the reserve funds in order to fund the debt charges. So you don't have to go into a negative. You can go out and debenture. Next slide. So then we have the non-obligatory reserve and reserve funds. So these are, the community improvement plan, elections, general insurance, winter maintenance, and then the water and the wastewater. Now on the next slide. These are ones that we want to continue. These are ones that we're writing more detail around, and we'd like to see them continue into the future. So we've provided the purpose of each of the individual funds. I think they're fairly straightforward. The sources of funding, something like winter maintenance is basically funded by surpluses from the prior year. If we budget, last year was a very light amount of snow, so you probably had surpluses. So take that money and set it aside. This year, they're forecasting a very heavy year for snow. So you went from a light year followed by a very heavy year. So those contributions will help to smooth out from year to year. The elections reserve, obviously it's to deal with the election occurs every 4 years. The clerk should be providing an estimate on what those costs should be, and then through the budget process, you annually contribute. General insurance really is to top up. You budget for a certain amount of claims and such, but there's always, unfortunately, certain years where excessive amounts. So this is amounts that'll be set aside for from year-end reserves. When the funds are available, based on the guidance provided, the treasurer will come forward and advise where any surpluses at the end of the year will go. And then your community improvement fund is basically being funded by the hydro dividends. So that's something that would be continued. So those funds, as they come in, they get set aside in the community improvement, and then they're used. The target balances, basically, for the most part, we don't want them to go below zero. It's very important. With winter maintenance, we'd like to see the balance being roughly about 25% of the 5-year average winter maintenance operating expenditures. So we do get, and if you historically, when I worked at municipalities, when we were doing these types of things, we would track the weather patterns and see, the years that are light, the years that are very heavy for snow, and we try to average out, the expenditures and provide for reserve fund funding. So what we've suggested here is that the minimum balance is 25% of take a look at the last 5 years expenditures, and it should be about 25% of that 5-year balance. The maximum, if available, the maximum amount would be basically the highest single year of snowfall, like your costs associated with winter maintenance. So a low of 25% of the 5-year average. The highest is the 1 year's worth of revenue for the highest year in the last 5 years. Elections, basically, the maximum amount is the amount that the clerk deems adequate in order to run the elections. But basically, when you hit the 4th year, you shouldn't overdraw the reserve. It should go down to 0 potentially, and obviously no less than that. General insurance, we've talked about. We're basically targeting about 25% of the claims deductions over the last 5 years. And then lastly, community improvement, basically shouldn't go below 0 balance, and you should be looking to fund equal to the following year's forecasted amount. Next slide. On the water mains and sewers, generally these are primarily for capital purposes. So they'll be, you normally do a 10-year water rate study and wastewater rates. So through that process, the reserve funds will be rationalized. And as well, this will be fed, information would be fed in through your asset management exercise. So we've got specialized reserves because these are rate supported for water and wastewater, and specifically for those assets. Next slide. Now, these are, on the left-hand side, are your existing reserves and reserve funds. On the right-hand side, we're suggesting that some of these be combined into a brand new reserve or reserve fund. So you can see on the left-hand side, we have really things that are related on the property tax side to infrastructure. So you've got infrastructure, you've got buildings and facilities, you've got equipment replacement, and you've got capital rate stabilization. We're suggesting that they all be combined into asset management reserve. So this is a process that staff go through, and it's mandatory through the Infrastructure and Jobs and Prosperity Act. So it is becoming something which is mandated for municipalities. You're in a stage of conversion right now, with the ultimate target date of being 2024 for completing and having your plan and your financial plan in place with it. The next one is really rate stabilization and your working fund reserves. So we're looking to combine the two of them because one provides for stabilizing, the other is more cash flow. So we're suggesting that the two of them be combined into one. And that means you get a slightly larger amount, but you can, instead of, you're combining the resources in order to make sure you can draw on one or the other throughout the year. Next slide. So the asset management reserves, as you can see, I've, for the most part, talked to these. These are tax supported. It's combining it for all assets, your equipment, your your vehicles, your infrastructure such as roads and facilities, etc. So, and as I say, the target, what we'll be looking at is that'll be rationalized in part through the asset management plan and in part through your capital budget plan. So Revenues will be, you've got special levies that'll be set aside for funding the capital. You've got revenues that are derived through your equipment replacement reserve currently. And then you're going to have budget surpluses. So once again, between the asset management plan and then at the through the budget process, the treasurer will be providing advice on whether additional budget surpluses need to be allocated towards that purpose, et cetera. So the target balance, as I say, will be rationalized through the asset management plan. You shouldn't go below zero, but you should be building towards your longer term capital budget for these expenditures. Next slide. Tax rate stabilization. So this is to combine your working funds and your stabilization. So these are basically the targets are to try and have in this special reserve 10%, equal to 10% of your property tax revenue needs. So if you're, taxing for $8 million, then this reserve fund should be $800,000. You may have to draw on it for stabilization purposes, but we still need money for working fund. So it should never drop below 5% of your property taxes. To rationalize this and to give you perspective, because sometimes is this 5%, 10% reasonable or not? We'll show you your comparator neighbors and give you a perspective on these orders of magnitude. Next slide. You can see, so I'll have to explain it because it's a little bit busy, but if you see working from left-hand side to right-hand side, you have working funds for each of these municipalities. Yours currently is at a just over 1.4, almost $1.5 million. There's contingency reserves, and then there's tax rate stabilization. So if you total up the three of those, you can see you've got a total amount of about $1.6 million. Now, if you look at Niagara on the Lake, they're the lowest amount at $375,000. The largest amount for this is in St. Catharines, and they're running at about $5.3 million. Now, the next column from the total, so from that orange, is the amount that you recover from property taxation. So if you take that orange total and you divide it by the property tax in the white, then go to the end on the very right-hand side. This gives you the percentage. So if you take a look at what you're using for working funds, for contingencies, for tax stabilization, you can see currently you're at about your 10% level. You're at 9.7%, which we would deem a reasonable amount. If you, one of the things to keep in mind is that, and I always talk to in these processes about what your collection practices are. Obviously, at the beginning of the year, January, February, March, and April, you have expenditures that are being made. You normally, as part of your tax policy, you allow a certain amount of short-term borrowing in order to make sure that you've got enough cash to pay all of your bills. That is what working funds is for, is to cover that cash flow balance. Now, we've looked at, you've got some very strong monthly payments. So you've got a lot of people that have signed up to pay monthly, and you've got a very strong amount that you're receiving on a month-by-month basis. So I think it's in the range of 50 or 60% of those taxes are being paid, or your customers are paying on a monthly basis. So that's attributing quite well to this 10% target, is because you have very strong collections, so your cash flow is in good shape. I'm not clear enough what the percentage is for the rest of the municipalities, but working funds is a very important area. But if you take a look at its percentage, you're right in the midpoint. The lowest is Niagara on the Lake. They're only covering themselves at a 3%. You look at the highest amount, West Lincoln's running at about 21%. So once again, you're right in the middle. And I think that 10% is a very strong amount. As I say, don't, target not to really go above it, but I wouldn't go any less than 5% on an annual basis. Next slide. So there are some reserve funds we're suggesting to be created. There's a museum, so we're suggesting a museum endowment fund. Now there are some reserves and reserve funds for museums currently. So one of the things we'd like to do is to replace the existing museum build reserve fund and create the museum endowment. Now, the museum endowment fund is proposed to be as a general purpose reserve. It'll help them with any capital budget issues. It'll also be used for basically acquiring, conserving, studying artifacts and exhibits. Generally, these will be created through fundraising activities through the museum. So they'll raise the funds, we'll just set them aside, and it'll assist in funding some of their initiatives. The balance shouldn't fall below zero, and there's no maximum we would assess. That would be something that the museum would consider. Next slide. Another reserve fund to be created is the library. As you're aware, we're going through a process right now with the library. So, obviously this is funds that'll be set aside for their operating and capital purpose, but right now we haven't defined it, pending the completion of that potential amalgamation study. Next slide. And we've got a couple of reserves and reserve funds that we're suggesting to be terminated. You currently have a skateboard reserve. There's no money in it, and it was originally set up to fund skate park. The project's completed, is at zero balance, so we're suggesting close that down. The museum building reserve, right now, it's at zero. But as we say, we'd like to rename this to the endowment fund, as was discussed a few slides ago. And then you have a hydro dividends reserve fund. What we're looking to do is to transfer this money into the community improvement plan reserve, and then as well with any of the contributions coming in from your hydro dividend, routing that money through to the community improvement plan in order to fund those initiatives. You have a couple of others. You've got the Gateway and Wayfinding Reserve, West Lincoln Memorial Hospital, and the Technology Modernization Reserve. Those reserves have balances in them right now, but they're not finished what they're originally intended for. But we would perceive at the end, because they're special target reserves, when you reach the end and attain your objectives, we would look to close those down over time as well. Next slide. And one more, the next slide. So with your indulgence, we're at the end. We're happy to receive any input from council, and we will take that back and be drafting or preparing the final report, and that should be submitted before council towards the end of October. And through the chair, that completes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Gary. Obviously, we went over the 15 minutes, but I think it was important, as this is a topic that we're all interested in, and it was time well spent. So nice presentation. I do have our Director of Finance and Innovation who would like to have the floor. Go ahead, Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Just hello and good evening, members of council. I really want to thank Watson Associates and the input from town staff, both Kayla Snowcroft and Terry Chawala, to get us to this place. Their analysis, their input was integral. You'll see following this presentation or this discussion, the policy that we're putting forward, it has some of the general terms on establishment, the thresholds, how we will invest, deal with interest, our review timelines, etc. I do think it's important for us to establish a baseline so we have something to measure against. It's something I committed to council from last year's budget process for more transparency related to reserves, to give council some comfort that the reserves and the reserve fund are adequate and that we have a path forward or an approach that looks to be prudent, not necessarily risk adverse, but not necessarily overly conservative, but somewhere in the middle so that we can manage all the projects and items coming forward. So going through this year's budget process, the 2022 budget process, we will be making some adjustments in some of the reserve amounts and reserve funds, some that are currently sitting at year-end 2020 at a zero balance, like the winter maintenance fund. We'll have to move some funds around to try to hit these targets. But this is our first step to that longer-term approach for fiscal sustainability. So, and again, I want to thank Kayla and Terry for all their hard work and Watson for the great presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Do we have any questions from council? Councilor Bernay.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Yeah, just a couple of comments and then a couple of questions maybe to staff. You know, really glad to see this come forth. Very fulsome report. Really pleased to see, you know, all the charts that were shown with the purpose and the source of funding, and then the comparisons with a lot of our municipalities across Niagara. I guess we should be confident that we seem to be in the middle of the pack. And, you know, one of the big takeaways, you know, I've got there is that, you know, we're appropriately using our cash flow and our money's available to us to stay around that 10% threshold. So it looks like we're in good shape. And so, you know, going into budget, we won't be asking the questions and kind of getting arbitrary answers and really not knowing what the threshold should be. So I think moving forward, this is going to be a really great lens to look at. And I appreciate Director Wagner and all his staff putting the efforts through on this. Just a couple of questions, and I'll try to keep them brief, but you know, when you look at these charts and you compare us to what we've got reserves and reserve funds with other municipalities, as Gary pointed out, we're pretty equal, 4 out of 5, and then we've got most of them except the library. And I think, you know, most of the reserves, we all understand what they're for. Just one of the questions I had through you, Chair, to maybe Terry. It's being recommended by Watson that we close up Gateway and Finding Reserve, the West Lincoln Hospital, and Technology Modernization Reserve. So I think I know what two of three of those are, but through you to Terry, just maybe a little bit on the Technology Modernization Reserve, what it's specifically supposed to be for, how much money is sitting in the reserve, and if the number is what I think it is, a fairly significant number, what is that money going to be spent on?
Sherry?
Through you, Chair. The Technology Modernization Fund was set up in 2019 when we got a grant from the Ontario government. It was intended to help various municipalities to modernize their processes and procedures in order to help mitigate future cost increases. So when we got it, we brought a report to council and said we were working on a corporate systems master plan that would identify all of the projects and that were necessary in order to move us along in our digitization efforts. So we undertook that study in 2019, and then and it has outlined a number of projects and initiatives. Then COVID hit, and we've actually had a lot of the items on our list be covered from the COVID funding due to trying to get everyone to work remotely. But we do have a few projects that have been earmarked for that money. And Director Wagner is working with the IT team to put together a council report coming in October about the various projects that they're proposing to use the funding for, and also an update for the work that's already been done on them. And those are pretty significant investments.
So we're gonna look to spend that money here in the fall and then close the account. Is that the idea? The reserve?
So through the chair, yeah, it we'll close the reserve as soon as the funds have been completely spent. I know Director Wagner has his hand up as well, so he might want to chime in.
Yes, Councillor. On October 18th, we're coming with a fulsome report to Council to talk about the planned IT projects. As Terry mentioned, COVID kind of put a wrinkle and slowed down some of the expected outcomes. It was supposed to, some of the money was supposed to go to the council chambers upgrade. Some was to support there's a work order system that they're implementing as well. I think I mentioned the website. So there's a list of projects that were highlighted in 2019 that this funding was supposed to go for. Once those projects are completed, any excess funds will obviously be moved around to address any other funding gaps. But through the October 18th submission, now that we have a business analyst on board, we fully expect to utilize those funds and move some of the technology modernization initiatives that were proposed a while ago forward. That's the hope and expectation on my end, and I'm looking forward to the questions from council on October 18th.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, both Terry and Lawrence, for those fulsome responses. Through you, Chair McPherson, if I could just ask one more additional question.
And before we do that, Councillor, I see that our CAO has got his hand up. I wonder if he's got comments with regards to your last question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do, and I will try to be really quick. Just piggybacking a little bit on what Terry and Lawrence said. Other items, Councillor, I know we've spoken about it with many members of Council, but a website redesign will also be part of that. And a lot of these monies really came from the province's, desire to have municipalities look after the regional review, and that not going forward on how we come together, how we use digitization and other sorts of modernizing partnerships to accomplish work in a very different way. So just wanted to add that, but you'll hear a little bit more, I think, both in the communications update that Ms. Busnello and Mr. Deanny are going to give you, but also on October 18th about things around the website, which are part of that project.
Very good. Councillor, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So I just had one additional question. It could be either to Mr. Scanlon for his perspective as a consultant working with other municipalities, and then maybe I'd also like to hear from staff. But just with regards to the idea that we're going to terminate or close and then transfer the hydro dividend reserve fund to a community improvement plan reserve. I'm not questioning this in any way, shape, or form. I'm just looking to see the report. The presentation states that through discussions with staff, this reserve is to be closed. Just through you, Mr. Chair, I believe if I'm correct, as a town of Lincoln, we've been a member, we've been a shareholder in Penn West Hydro, getting dividends for the last 21 years since 2000. So those have always flowed, I guess, into that reserve fund. What is the main reason, Gary, from your perspective as a consultant, that you think it's prudent and wise to move it to a community improvement plan reserve?
Through the chair, my understanding is most of those funds have been directed since it was created. Since you've sold off your assets and started to receive the dividends, my understanding is that's generally where it's been put. I'm not quite sure where and how a separate reserve was generated, but for consistency, we're just suggesting that you continue with past practice. And how you're directing it is not different than how a lot of municipalities are directing it. So it's fairly consistent with the way that others use their funding, their dividends.
Thank you, Gary. And I see Terry's hand up as well. Terry, go ahead.
Sure. So through you, Chair, just when we were discussing the various reserves and reserve funds that are necessary, we are directing those dividends into the CIP to help to fund that. There was just a minor amount left over when we did the transfer over to it. So it's sitting there with a small balance. So it doesn't really have a purpose in the hydro dividend reserve fund. So, but later on, so once we have our CIPs and if they're fully funded and it's determined that the dividends no longer need to be there, we would come back to council with a recommendation to then transferring those hydro dividend fund to a different reserve fund. So really the hydro dividend reserve fund was set up just to hold that chunk of money rather than for a purpose for it to be used for. Whereas we would rather put it into a reserve for a purpose.
Okay, yeah, and I only asked that question because I remember when the fundraising was going on for the Fleming Center back in 2012 to 2014. It's my understanding that that council did make a decision to take money from the hydro dividend fund and put it towards the Fleming Center. So I do believe this is a wise and prudent decision to put it into something where the funds are going to be used and call it a community improvement plan. But I was just looking for Mr. Scanlon and staff's kind of comments as to the discussions surrounded that. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate the report. It was very enlightening and great timing as we go into budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Timmers, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chairman Person. To Scanlon and Mr. Tan, thank you very much. Excellent presentation tonight. I think this is a really great process that we're going through, and to see the charts and how we stack up against the other municipalities is really good information for us as councillors to get an understanding of where we're at. And we certainly seem to be in very good shape in our municipality. I think the only question I do have is around the museum building reserve fund, that it will now change into an endowment fund. So I understand you said that it was only for fundraising fund. So it'll be like a holder for fundraising dollars to be accessed by the museum staff. And I see perhaps through to Ms. Chirola.
Terry, go ahead.
So through the chair, it is a reserve fund that museum staff asked to be established, and they would direct all of their fundraising funds into it. However, it would be at council's discretion to approve the spending of it. So if they are fundraising for a specific item, they would still request, they would still require council's approval to go ahead and go out and purchase it. But they just wanted where while they're doing the fundraising, they wanted to be able to assure the public that the money was going to be used just for the museum capital items and that it wouldn't be put towards general operating. Because I believe sometimes donors have that idea that and maybe it's just going towards operating, but they wanted to have a specific reserve fund.
Thank you for that. That makes perfect sense to me. Just through you, Chair, my other question is around the library, to establish a library reserve fund. And I wasn't really clear on how that's going to work. So I'd like a little more clarification on that.
Terry, go ahead.
Through you, Chair. The way that it would work at the end of each operating year, once we do the final closing of the books, any operating surplus for the library board would be set aside in that reserve fund. And then once there's some funds available in there, if the library was to have a deficit in year, they would come back to council and ask to use the reserve funds in order to offset the deficit. So it's more of a stabilization reserve for the library itself, separate from the town's reserves.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Terry. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Timmers. Mary Easton.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. There are certainly some very excellent changes in this report. I'll start with the library reserve. Is the intention, and I'm not sure who to direct this to, so I'm going to direct it to Mr. Wagner. Should we understand that it's the intention of the town to hold the library not as a separate program under the Library Act, which is structurally where it belongs, but that we are embracing the value of the library in a different way by creating a stabilization reserve for them, because that money would come from the levy. Is that correct?
Mr. Wagner.
Through you, Chair McPherson, to Maurice, and I think Terry has a better response or is ready to respond to that question.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Terry.
Through the chair, it would actually help to establish the library board as its own independent agency rather than being it with the town. Currently, any surplus for the library board goes into our general town stabilization reserve. And then if there's a deficit, it comes out of the town general. Whereas setting up a separate library board reserve fund would make them an independent, and they would need to use their own reserve fund instead of the town's general.
Right, okay. I like that. Mr. Chairman, very pleased to see the way asset management is starting to be more pronounced. And we all know that that's a system that's we're gradually getting to. It certainly is a much longer process than I ever expected. However, I think, Mr. Scanlon, I want to thank you very much for your report. It's certainly great to have this on the table at this time. Do municipalities change their, what's the word I'm looking for? Do they change their division, the way they organize their reserve funds in any way during high growth periods? I'm asking this question because I think with the system that you're recommending here, that our growth revenue and allocations are going to make us tremendously more sustainable. But does it have anything, does the structure of this have anything to do with those high growth periods? Does that make any sense?
Obviously, through the chair, your obligatory reserves, for parkland dedication and for DC certainly address the high growth because there's a significant amount of assets that have to be built in order to accommodate the growth. As you grow as well, they will operating expenditures will increase, etc. They will help the existing taxpayers by contributing as well towards these balances or these targets that we've talked about. How municipalities organize themselves, we do see municipalities that are in a faster pace growth. They build more contingencies and for more fluctuations in the economy or because the building market. In more stable municipalities that have less growth, they have more reliance on, just to some extent, a stable revenue source. So you're right. Where we see the big changes are in stabilization and contingencies.
Okay. My third question, Mr. Chairman, is really, and maybe it's not so much a question, but Mr. Scanlon may have some comments on this. But when I look back at how much we've been spending the last 6-7 years on capital projects, I truly believe that it is, this is what is meeting public expectation. And so our current management of reserves and reserve funds have supported our ability to increasingly do more and more projects and really meet that value for money expectation that the public has. Do you agree with that, Mr. Scanlon, as you went through and looked at the way we were doing business and using our monies?
Through the chair, absolutely. I think you've already, developed a lot of through the budgeting process and targeting infrastructure renewal as well as planning for growth. I think you've done a good job of balancing both. What all we're trying to achieve is to put into place a closer link between your asset management plan, which you've done well. Now there's a little bit more statute behind it, but I think you've been undertaking those processes quite well anyways. So really what this is to some extent is a formalization of the reserve funds to support what you've been doing quite well in the past.
Right. Okay, well, that's great. Thank you very much. I think you've certainly done a good job on our behalf, and this will help us move forward with a great deal of confidence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councillor Pachariba.
Thank you, Chair McPherson, and through you, thank you very much, Gary, for this. Sitting on both the library and museum boards and the museum fundraising subcommittee. These are both things we had talked about at the board level about establishing reserves, to be for fundraising, especially for the museum, and from the library's aspect to make it more self-sustaining. So instead of drawing upon the general levies if there's an overage, but then again at this, or if there's a shortage, but at the same time of an overage, to be able to take advantage of that, then that will fund it. So excellent to see this, and I'm sure both committees will be very, very pleased. So thank you very much, and thank you, Lawrence and your staff, for recognizing these, as we had talked about them at the committee level, and now seeing them come to fruition is excellent. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Michalek.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Through you, I'm not sure who best to direct this, probably to Mr. Wagner. With regards to some of these reserves that we have, they're somewhat fluid in nature in terms of how we use them and unknown. So take, for example, the winter reserve. There's another one I can't think of off the top of my head, the legal one or the insurance one as well, where you don't really know how much you're using from year to year. Do we receive reports on the balances and the transfers of those reserves in terms of whether or not we dipped into them, or whether we have from year to year a surplus, whether we dipped into them, used them or not? Just a question, given their fluid nature.
Director Wagner.
Through your Chair McPherson to Councillor Michalek, yes, of course we do. We come through the budget process when we identify capital projects. We source where the funding is coming from, whether it's DC funds, whether it's debt, whether it's levy. And our intent going forward, and as part of this year's budget process, there will be a separate reserve section showing all of our reserves, the range of reserves and what's left in the reserves to make sure it's within value. So we're definitely coming forward with a lot more information related to that. And this year will be our first start as a separate section to provide you some of that comfort and information you require. If there's additional information following this year's budget process with the reserve section, we will definitely look to enhance it going forward as well. But we do, through the budget process, identify which reserves are funding which project, and subsequently through the budget process, we will be providing a reserve balance and potentially a year-over-year change, and in comparison to our thresholds that we're establishing through the policy and through this presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear, that I wasn't sure we were doing in the past as far as the amounts used within those reserves that, they're not specific to projects or items of that nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. So I see no other hands up. So my only add to what has been commented on and questioned is just a comment with regards to the policy and the clarity that the policy has brought to the establishment of reserves, the termination of reserves, all of the various contributions, withdrawals. It really brings great clarity to how it works. And I compliment the town staff and Watson and Associates for helping us as council to really understand how does reserves and reserve funds actually get created and actually get have a life and then get terminated. So thank you very much for that. I just wanted to thank Gary, Byron, and your staff for the excellent presentation tonight. And look forward to your final presentation in October. And of course, thank you to Lawrence, Terry, Kayla, all the team. We raised our hand, Vice Chair Russell and I in January with a hope that we would get this through, and you have met all of your committed dates thus far, so there's no reason I would believe that we're going to miss the October date. So nicely done so far. So that being the case, there being no further discussion, I have a motion moved by Councillor Pachariva that Council receive and file the delegation by Gary Scanlon and Byron Tans, Senior Project Coordinator, Watson and Associates, regarding the 2021 reserves and reserve funds update. I will ask the Deputy Clerk to call out the vote. Devan, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Bernay,
Yes.
Councillor McPherson,
Yes.
Councillor Miklick,
Yes.
Councillor Pachariva,
Yes.
Councillor Reimer,
Yes.
Councillor Regina,
Yes.
Councillor Timmers.
Yes.
Thank you. And Mayor Easton?
Yes.
Thank you. That carries, Chair.
Thank you, Devan. We will now move into item 6.3.1, report FN-15-21 regarding reserves and reserve funds policy. Do members of council have any further questions? Seeing none, there being no further.
I just saw the mayor's hand.
Oh, sorry about that. Mayor Easton, go ahead.
Oh, you're on mute, Mayor Easton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry. I just want to ask a question about the Museum Endowment Fund. Would this fund be set up so that we would only use the interest on the balance? I don't know who would answer that.
So through the chair, no, it wouldn't be set up that way. It's not going to be a trust. It's going to be a reserve fund. So the interest and the principal can be used as at council's discretion.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. There being no further discussion, I have a motion moved by Councillor Miklick to receive and file report FN-15-21 regarding reserves and reserve funds policy and approve the reserve and reserve funds policy attached as Appendix A and direct the treasurer to prepare a bylaw to establish the reserves and reserve funds outlined in Appendix B for council's approval. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call out the vote. Devan, go ahead.
Thank you. Councillor Bernay,
Yes.
Councillor McPherson,
Yes.
Councillor Miklick,
Yes.
Counselor Patriva,
Yes.
Counselor Reimer,
Yes.
Counselor Ojima,
Yes.
Counselor Timmers, Counselor Timmers.
Yes.
Thank you. And Mayor Easton.
Support.
That carries. Thank you.
Thank you, Devan. We now move to the consent agenda. There are no consent agenda items this evening. We move to reports. We'll now consider item 6.3.2, report AD-18-21 corporate communications strategy update. The Manager of Corporate Communications will speak to this item. However, the Director of Economic Development and Communications would like to say a few words before we begin. Paul, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair McPherson, and good evening, Mayor Easton and members of Council. Communications is pleased to be in front of you this evening to present to you the framework and process that we'll be undertaking to complete Lincoln's first ever corporate communication strategy. From a corporate standpoint, we see communications as being an integral component in how we engage and inform our citizens on the great work we're doing on their behalf. That is why, through a formal communication strategy, we look forward to increasing the ways in which we engage and speak to our residents in a meaningful way. I know Lillian has a great report and presentation for you this evening. And in fact, she's already started to roll out a lot of the processes that she will be mentioning tonight. But in addition, I know Liliana will also be touching on some of the key activities accomplished in 2021 to date. So without further ado, thank you, and over to you, Liliana.
Thank you, Paul. We will now have Liliana begin the presentation. Go ahead.
Thank you and good evening. Thanks for the introduction, Director Deanne. I'm here to present to Council tonight, or the Committee of the Whole tonight, the Corporate Communication Strategy Update. Deputy Clerk, if you could move to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to provide a bit of a high-level outline of what the corporate communication strategy is going to look like, what we hope to achieve through the development of corporate communication strategy for the town of Lincoln. I'll provide a bit of an update on some of the key areas of focus for 2021, which we presented in the spring. We touched upon some of those areas that we would be devoting some of our energy and resources to, and I'll provide a bit of an update on those areas. We'll get into the process for developing the communication strategy, which includes outlining what the next steps are and timelines for rolling out within the next several months. Next slide, please. So what we want to achieve through a corporate communication strategy is manyfold, but really at the highest level, we really want to understand what the community members want and need to know from the town, and how they prefer to learn what's happening in Lincoln. So integral to that process is really, if we want to understand, then we will include a consultation component with the strategy, which I will get into in the process. But it's also looking at determining some short, medium, and long-term communications priorities, not only for council and staff, but also for the community. Next slide, please. Of course, with any corporate communications strategy or any communications efforts that we undertake, we ensure that we align these with council priorities. And really, communications touches on all of council's priorities to be a welcoming community, a connected community, vibrant and resilient. So specifically looking at increasing public knowledge through education and promotion of Lincoln services, programs, and initiatives, and enhancing citizen engagement and participation in identifying public service improvements to bring about greater transparency, accountability, and social inclusion, resulting in tangible improvements to people's lives. And I think through some of the actions that we've taken in 2021 to date, we'll see how we've been achieving these goals and how we can set out to do so through more fulsome corporate communication strategy. Next slide, please. So touching on the key areas of focus for 2021, we have, as as we've discussed earlier, and as many of you have been, most of you have been keeping in touch or up to date throughout the year, we have invested quite a lot of effort in our Speak Up Lincoln site, our public engagement site, which it launched in February with just 4 projects, and now we're at close to 25 pages on the site. And I have to say, at the time that I was writing the report and working on the presentation, we had 4,600 visits since launching. And I just checked Speak Up Lincoln just before tonight's meeting, and we're at 6,100. So just in that few weeks amount of time, we've had quite an increase in traffic to the site. So it's clearly, we're getting the word out about Speak Up Lincoln. People are engaging, people are looking for information. And we're really proud of this really important tool that we've developed to keep our community engaged and informed about some of the key projects happening and opportunities to provide their input. We're always looking at different ways to keep our community informed through digital and also print opportunities through newsletters and newspaper notices. We've delivered several newsletters throughout the year, and we will continue to do so and look to incorporate these kinds of tactics in our strategy so that we have a balance of ways to get the word out to the community. Next slide, please. In the earlier presentation, the Lincoln.ca website was mentioned a couple times in terms of an IT project, but of course there is a very strong communications aspect to this project, and we are undertaking a complete web redesign process. The process is already underway, so we are just preparing to develop an RFP, doing a little bit of internal consultation, understanding staff needs, and then looking to, we've engaged with council individually, council members, and of course, we do always welcome any input and suggestions that members of council may have on the website redesign. We will continue to consult and go through a formal process to enlist a vendor before the end of the year, and work through a process to hopefully launch the redesigned website later in 2022. Of course, there's many opportunities to engage with departments throughout the organization and support the work that all of our service areas are doing. Communications is working closely with the tourism and external partners to develop the tourism branding. So I'm sure council will hear more about the tourism branding and where that's going in the next few weeks. Next slide, please. Just quick updates on media relations. We've had quite a bit of coverage on our advocacy efforts through the GR program and some funding announcements that have really been at the forefront this year, and just demonstrating some of the initiatives that position Lincoln as a leader in Niagara. We've just been trying to leverage those opportunities to draw attention to some of the great, outside of the box thinking and initiatives that have really that really bring value to the community and elevate our position. Just a quick note on some of the internal processes. We initiated a communications coordinating working group to eliminate some of those silos and share information across departments. So that's a process that's gotten well underway. We're looking at working with our partner Civic Connect to develop an intranet that would support internal sharing of information as well. So just looking at these opportunities, thinking outside the box to create these opportunities to really leverage our communications internally, and then be able to better communicate with our residents and our community at large. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was just an update on some of the initiatives that have gotten underway in 2021. We'll keep up that that work. And in the meantime, we are looking to develop an overarching corporate communications strategy. So the phases of this process will include a review, followed by an audit, consultation, and development. And in the next few slides, I'll get into more details about each. Next slide, please. So in the review phase, we will look to work with a consultant to review some recent communication strategies of other municipalities, look at best practices, and learn lessons from other communities. So we'll look at communities of similar sizes, similar demographics, similar economies, and neighboring communities to determine whether just to look at best practices and some takeaways that we could apply to our communication strategy. So we're looking to do this before the end of the year in this upcoming quarter. Next slide, please. Following the review, we'll look to do an audit, which is more internally focused. So looking at what we've been doing, understanding the needs and resources of the corporation, and just reviewing what kinds of tools, templates, and tactics we've been using that are currently in use, and what's working well, and maybe identify some areas for improvement. Also targeting Q4 of 2020. Next slide, please. So consultation will be key to this process. We want to ensure that our strategy is not cookie cutter. It's not something that a consultant kind of takes from another municipality and just kind of brings on us. We want to make sure that it really reflects the needs and the values and the desires of the Lincoln community. So we want to know about how residents want to receive information, what kind of news, what they would like to learn more about, and how they would like to engage. We think that we've developed some outstanding tools to date, but we are really looking to customize and understand which ways they really do prefer, and that could also depend from stakeholder to stakeholder. So customizing a plan that really reflects the community. Of course, part of this, an integral part of this consultation will be with members of council. So we will look to hold some sessions as part of that consultation process to engage council and obtain your unique and important perspective on our strategy. Next slide, please. And of course, the final phase will be to develop the strategy that should really reflect the vision and the values of our organization and of our community. Includes the key audiences and stakeholders, those communications objectives. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, they should look at short, medium, and long-term objectives, and also some action items and performance metrics. Those are important to ensure that we've actually been successful in achieving those objectives. The timeline for this piece would be Q2 2022. Next slide, please. And finally, we would expect to present the strategy for council approval in Q3 2022, which would be a culmination of all of these phases and reflect the objectives that we set out when developing the strategy. Next slide, please. Thank you, everyone. That concludes the presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that any of you may have.
Are there any questions? Mary Easton, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, one of the observations that I made in this report, which is really, I think, quite enlightening, is that in Lincoln, where we have a number of 1- and 2-person departments, there are a lot of quite significant projects that are essentially worked on, as we would hear people say, on the edge of a desk. There isn't a person to look after every large project, and yet we're really punching our weight pretty high for community and the scope of programs that we're delivering to the community. So I want to ask Liliana to speak to the issue of how a person in her role and how the communications department is able to draw in not only the interests, but the individual skills of some of those people who probably have very little time to spend. How is it that you're able to do that? What strategies are you using? Because I recognize, as much as we could all tell you that you're doing a fabulous job, and you are, we know that there's many, many people involved in what you're doing. So you've become this central focus of coordination. Maybe not the best word, but Mr. Chairman, I'd like to hear from Liliana how she sees that now and where she sees that rolling out in the future.
Liliana, go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Chair, to the Mayor. Great question. I think it's a lot of coordination, but it's also a lot of internal communication. And I think I spoke to some of the tools that we're putting into place, for example, through this communications coordinating working group, just opening up the dialogue internally, encouraging representatives from each department to have those conversations within their department, structuring conversations around how we can provide support, some of the initiatives that might might seem like we have a number of initiatives that sort of rise to the forefront, and then there are others that we can draw on to really inform the community about things that are happening that they might not be aware of, because as you mentioned, Mayor, that they might be just sort of a smaller project on someone's desk, but they really do have an impact on the community. So we look to draw those types of opportunities. We also look to there are some initiatives where we develop a more fulsome communications strategy for to support those larger programs and initiatives, and there are some that we look to have a bit of a simpler approach. We might share some information through some newsletters, through social media, to kind of spark interest in the community. So I think it's just using a variety of different tools. And kind of understanding what level of promotion and what level of engagement and communication are needed for each of the projects. So again, a simple answer is that the communication internally, understanding what's happening, getting a pulse on what's happening internally and what's coming up, and then determining what best communications approach to share that information. I hope that answers your question.
It does, and I think that Council would agree that what you've done is really enriched the information that we're receiving to quite a significant extent, and by virtue of that, the community at large. I believe that the community is more engaged as a result of the work that you're doing and the way that you're doing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councillor Rajima.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to say I don't think there's not a whole lot of people putting their hands up, and partially it's because Paul and Liliana took the time to meet with us all individually and talk to us about the communication strategy and what's coming up, and so we learned quite a bit. And I'm really impressed with what I'm seeing, and it sounds like the participation in Speak Up Lincoln has increased by, if I heard it right, something like 50% in the last little while. That's crazy. It's great. I think there's a sense of comfort that people get from knowing that people are reaching out to them in their community and trying to engage them. And they get a sense of comfort as they receive the information. Not everybody's going to jump out and get involved. Not everybody will participate, but as the information's trickling in, I think they feel more a part of their community, and they feel a sense of comfort living here. So I just wanted to say that that I'm really excited about what I've been seeing coming out of the communications department, because we haven't always had that. Hasn't always been possible. So thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. I see no other hands up. I would just add, I see Mr. CAO's hand up. Go ahead, Mike.
Through you, Mr. Chair, and please feel free to, chime in first. I don't mind making some closing comments. I had one of Leanna's SMT colleagues recently share a comment with me, and I think it encapsulates her, but I will let you speak first, Chair McPherson.
I'd be very brief, and I was just going to say that, I think we've come a long way on our communications journey from several years ago to where we are today. I think we are doing a really nice job of reaching out to our community under various platforms, and I tip my hat to the communications team for all that we've accomplished to date. Is there the opportunity for continuous improvement? Absolutely, and I am very interested to see what we hear in our reach out to the community again, to see what it is they would like to see us start doing, stop doing. And I'm wondering, just in my own mind, what we will get from them. It may not be along the social media lines. It may not be along newsletter lines. It may get to things like, how are we receiving phone calls into our town hall, and how responsive are we from a communication standpoint? So that's my only comment. I like where we're going. I am a absolute supporter of strategy and plans, and that if we are going to put them on paper, they're more than likely going to get done. So I am 100% behind your effort in putting this communication strategy together. Go ahead, Mr. CAO.
Through you, Mr. Chair, and again, thanks for the opportunity just to provide a couple of quick comments. I was also going to highlight a lot about what you raised, and that is, the importance of looking at all means of communication, and some of that is customer service, some of that is simply how we pick up the phone, and those sorts of processes. And I know Liliana's working with Shannon and her team on a number of the customer service initiatives. Having done communications a little bit in a past life, many years ago, it is not an easy job, sometimes a thankless job. So I do want to thank Liliana, Paul, the team, in terms of what they're doing. And as I said, I wanted to read a comment I received from a member of SMT not too long ago about Liliana. And it says, "Really, Liliana is awesome, very supportive, and makes you want to work with her." And I think that captures kind of the essence of communications. It is about supporting others. As I said, a little bit thankless at times. I know Liliana probably covers her head and screams every now and then when I email her asking for something, but she does make you want to work with her. And so my thanks to her, my thanks to Paul for his support as well, and to Counsel for supporting kind of where we're going and evolving.
Very good. Liliana, any final comments?
Through you, Chair, just thank you for your comments and your feedback, everyone. I do agree. I think we've put some great measures in place. I think we're going in a good direction, and we do look for opportunities to improve and to better communicate with the community. That's what we set the yardstick, and we just always want to set it a little bit higher so that we can reach more and more people and engage more of the community. And I think, as Councillor Regina said, make them feel welcome and make them feel like they're part of the community. So that's really what we hope to achieve, and that's what we endeavor to capture through this corporate communications strategy. So thank you, everyone, for your comments. Appreciate it.
So there being no further discussion, I have a motion moved by Councillor Timmers that council receive and file for information report AD-18-21 regarding corporate communications strategy update. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call the vote. Van, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Councillor Brunet.
Yes.
Councillor McPherson.
Yes.
Councillor Mikulak.
Yes.
Councillor Katarina.
Yes.
Councillor Reimer.
Yes.
Councillor Regina.
Yes.
Councillor Timmers. Councillor Timmers.
I'm muted. Can you hear me?
I can.
said yes.
Thank
Yes.
you. And Mayor Easton.
Support.
Thank you. That carries, Chair.
We will now consider item 6.3.3, report AD-19-21, diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. The human resource specialist will speak to this item. Before she does, I have been asked to give the floor to our CAO. Mike, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to members of council. I did want to quickly introduce our diversity, inclusion, and equity policy, and then I will be throwing it over to Jacqueline, who can take you through a little bit of the high points of that. And of course, we're always open to questions. I think I start by highlighting that anytime you talk about diversity and inclusion, anytime we talk about it, it's more than policies, it's more than programs, it's more than headcounts. We want to be an equitable employer, and what that means is at times outpacing those that are around us. But we do that by respecting the unique needs, the perspectives, and potential of all those on our team. And I say team because I think every person in this organization, from the bottom right on the top, needs to have those perspectives, those unique needs and their potential, all respected. As a result, and when we do this, you've heard me often talk about the importance of building trust. That is how we build trust and confidence and commitment to one another, both as employer and as employee. I think oftentimes people look at these sorts of topics, they think, it's about a quota of race or gender. I'm telling you, I don't think it's any of that. It's an important conversation that we have, but it's about respect, it's about acceptance, it's about teamwork and innovation, and doing that despite all the differences we have. So when we all come together, and Jacqueline's going to talk a little bit about this, to collaborate around a common goal, everybody wins. And that's really what we talk about. And when we talk about this particular topic, what I mean, and I think, what we all mean. So Jacqueline, the floor is yours.
Thank you, I don't really have much to add to that. I definitely want to say that we have taken the information that, none of the information in the policy is new. It is all just coming from other policies that we have adapted and enhanced in this new one to make sure that the profile is there and that we can really highlight where we want to go with this. And as Mike said, it's more than quotas. It's more than tokens. It's real inclusion of diversity of thought, as well as of gender and ethnicity, and making sure everybody feels included and welcome at the table and not afraid to say their point of view, because it's only with the wide variety of opinions and backgrounds and experiences that we can truly make the best decisions for both the corporation and then hence the community. So I'm here if you have any questions that you want answered, and I'm happy to, I'm glad that we've got this in front of you guys so that we can move forward.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I'll open the floor to council for any questions. Councilor Brunet.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. I don't have any questions, but I certainly have a comment. Recall back in, it was either 2018 or 2019, I attended a session at one of the AMO conventions, and it was specifically on this inclusion, diversity, And I remember when I came back from the conference, called the CAO, and we had a conversation, and I basically said to Mike, you know, as an organization, what are we doing? Do we have a policy? You know, it's easy to walk the walk, but are you talking the talk? And, you know, are you following through? And, you know, are you doing everything you're doing? And we had a great discussion about that. And I'm really, really, really pleased to see that this is coming forward. You know, we hear it about it all the time, you know, from the region. You know, we see, you know, the gateway they put up in front of their building. You know, there's a lot of ways to show this, but I think it starts right with the organization, and then it flows out through the rest of the community. So hats off to all the people, including yourself, Jacqueline, and everyone, the CEO that are involved in this. Really look forward to seeing this move forward, and hope it's something that we can continue to demonstrate for decades to come.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Rajima.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Also very pleased to see this coming forward. I have a question under policy administration on page, the way page 2 of the PDF. I mean, we've heard that this isn't about numbers, and of course it's about a lot of things, and I'll get to that. But under policy administration, it says that this policy will apply, but is not limited to our practices and policies on recruitment and selection. So how will we actively recruit those with, and this is from earlier on in the policy, those with differences in age, color, disability, ethnicity, family or marital status, gender equity or expression, language, national origin, physical and mental ability, political affiliation, race, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and other characteristics. Is there a way to reach out and actively recruit people that are in these people that have characteristics that are or that are in this group that we might consider marginalized? And if that's a difficult question, I mean, I heard earlier on that I think one way that we achieve a welcoming environment is to act to walk the walk, achieve practice diversity of thought. We communicate out that we are an inclusive organization, and we work hard to build a reputation of being an inclusive organization. Is that what we do? Or is there ways that we actively, for example, when we have a committee that we're hiring for, is there ways that we actively seek people with characteristics that are in that group that I just mentioned? Or how are we planning to go about doing that? Or is it both?
Jacqueline?
Actually, I see through you, Mr. Chair, I see Mike has his hand up first, and then I will answer. I'll fill in his blanks.
Go ahead, Mike.
Mr. Chair, I mean, so a couple of comments, and I think, Jacqueline highlighted it, introducing the report, and she could speak to it far better than I and fill in those blanks. But we are committed, I think, at the end of the day, to always hiring the best person for the position. I say that, but the caveat to that is we need to be aware of policies. We need to be aware of our approaches. I think we need to examine our hiring practices regularly. Recently, I had a conversation around this particular topic. We need to always be looking at how we hire, where we promote, where we put out postings, and make sure that it is reaching those particular groups. If we have certain types of committees, for example, that are very much catered to certain stakeholder groups and certain constituencies, we need to make sure we're reaching out to those constituencies. We need to look at tweaking, again, our policies where they're necessary, keep up to speed with some of those changes. I think we can never look at this sort of stuff in terms of tokenism and just saying we're going to do it, but not actually do it. So I think to Councillor Brune's point about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. What does that look like? What does it mean? And I think we need to, ensure that we're going through more training. We've started some of those training sessions around unconscious bias. I think there's a lot out there that we need to educate ourselves on as a collective. And so, are we where we need to be on this particular topic, Councillor Regima, to your question? No. Is there a lot more we need to learn about and learn and educate ourselves with when we're doing these sorts of things? Yes. But we are starting to expand how we hire and looking at those hiring practices.
Thank you.
Hey.
And Jacqueline's going to speak.
Jacqueline, go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to add in terms of specifics, we are targeting where we're recruiting from in order to make sure that we're reaching those maybe some harder to reach populations or populations that don't necessarily think of us as the number one option. We are an employer of choice within the Niagara region, but we're just trying to expand our profile outside of the Niagara region so that we can make sure that we get the best person for the job. I am I'm very passionate about that, and I'm trying. I did say I wasn't going to get passionate on this subject tonight, so but I definitely, we are making like very concrete strides. We're building partnerships. We're building relationships with various community partners inside and outside Niagara to really highlight. And then we're also targeting on the websites to make sure that we're getting that to reach area or population, I should say.
Okay. Can I ask a question of clarification, Mr. Chair?
Sure, please go ahead.
Thank you. So as the rep on the Joint Accessibility Advisory Committee, I can think of a number of situations where, I had a conversation with someone the other day. He's on the committee and he's blind and he's applied for jobs, and he's a great speaker, great guy, very engaging. But he can't seem to get a job even doing like telephone soliciting. And it's just an example of something I think of when we think about finding ways to reach out to people with, for example, disabilities and what we can do, because, yeah, we want the best person for the job, but sometimes the best person for the job is the best person for the job because of the physical or mental challenges that they have. And it can be an asset to any organization. So my question is, will we anywhere in this process consult with the Joint Accessibility Advisory Committee?
Oh, through you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely, I'd be happy to do that. We've been talking with the March of Dimes, and actually where I used to work as well, they have their employment program. So we've been working with them, and we've been working with Employment Help Center here in town. But I'm happy to help with anybody because I could not agree with you more. And I think that it's a huge hidden skill set and skill population that we could use.
Okay, thanks. And I believe that we all have the staff and council. We all have the right thinking patterns to be everything that we want to be within this policy. So maybe Jacqueline, I'll reach out to you and talk to you more about that.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Reimer.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Over the last, we've done a lot of reading as councillors over the last little while. All the reports seem to have bunched up beginning of September, and this has been one of my favorite reads. I think it's a great report. That's a very comprehensive. I do a little bit of the HR in a very small way in my day job. It's an excellent document, and as the CEO mentioned, I think it was Mike. I like to be a leader in this area in the region, and I think this is good news. Thanks very much to Jacqueline and her team for this report. Thank you, Chair McPherson.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mikulik.
Thank you, Chair McPherson, through you to Jackie Buchanan. We don't get a chance to see you very often in these meetings. Always a pleasure, though.
in an effort to better educate myself with this, I didn't see, is it possible for myself to receive a copy of the questions or the slides that you would be proposed, or the questionnaire that prospective employees would be asked to fill out? Or
Are you talking about the training module?
yeah, the training module. Yeah, I didn't
Absolutely.
see it in the report, but would it be possible for me to be emailed that privately or confidentially?
Yep, I can do that. It's through, we have our own training platform called HR Downloads. So I can, you're set up on it, and I will send it over to you so that you can see what it's about.
I would love to do that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Counselor. Seeing no other questions, I have a motion moved by Counselor Pachariva that Council receive and file for information report AD-19-21 regarding the diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, and approve and adopt policy HR-2020-02 diversity, equity, and inclusion policy to inform policy and 2-1-01-02 hiring policy. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call out the vote. Van, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Brunei,
Yes.
Councillor McPherson,
Yes.
Councillor Micklick,
Yes.
Councillor Pachariva,
Yes.
Councillor Reimer,
Yes.
Councillor Rajima,
Yes.
Councillor Timmers.
Yes.
Thank you. Mayor Easton.
Support.
Thank you. That carries.
Thank you, Devan. We have now concluded the General Business and Finance Committee agenda. We will now rotate to allow Councillor and Chair JD Pachariva to assume the chair at this time for the Community Services and Infrastructure Development Committee agenda.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. We've got a pretty light agenda when it comes to community service and infrastructure tonight. So we've got no registered delegations this evening. We've got a couple consent items. So 7.2 is the consent agenda inclusive of 7.2.1 Age-Friendly Citizen Advisory Committee minutes of July 8th, 2021. And item 7.2.2 Museum Advisory Committee minutes of August 19th, 2021. Would any members of council like to remove any of these items from the consent agenda to discuss? Councillor McPherson.
Yeah, I don't need to remove, but I just want to have a comment on one of the museum.
Yeah, go ahead.
Or the minutes, and just a compliment to the young museum board or the museum committee. It's a very interesting set of minutes to read, I found, and certainly hitting on a lot of the strategic items that the museum laid out. So looks like this committee is off and running. So just want to make that comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Okay, so there being no further discussion, I have a motion moved by Councillor McPherson. The council receive and file for information the consent agenda inclusive of item 7.2.1 Age-Friendly Citizen Advisory Committee minutes of July 8th, 2021, and item 7.2.2 Museum Advisory Committee minutes of August 19th, 2021. I will now ask our clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Brunei,
Yes.
Councillor McPherson,
Yes.
Councillor Micklick,
Yes.
Councillor Pachariva,
Yes.
Councillor Reimer,
Yes.
Councillor Rajima,
Yes.
Councillor Timmers,
Yes.
Mayor Easton.
Support.
Thank you. That carries.
Thanks, Devan. There are no reports for consideration this evening. Do we have any committee remarks? I see none. There being no further business, I call this meeting adjourned at 8:59 p.m. Thank you very much.